I review a lot of code, and something that I'm consistently seeing being used poorly or not used at all is the finally method. And today I want to show you how to use finally and promises in general effectively. And stick around till the end because I will show you the one mistake that many of us make when using promises that can cause very obscure bugs. Let's dive into the code. On the right side is my terminal. We're going to be running some code and seeing its results in real time. Here I have app.ts, which references source finally. And this file is pretty empty. It just has a placeholder function that we're exporting, and that's available to app.ts. So let me fire up the terminal. npm run dev. Inside of the post request, what I really want to do is to introduce a delay to actually mimic an API request that would go out into a server and potentially give you a success or an error response. Currently, we're returning a promise. Notice that post is an async function and we're returning a promise, and we have the resolve and reject functions. We're going to use those functions, but we're going to use them inside of a set timeout so that we can introduce a delay. So I'm going to set a timeout here, and that timeout is going to be 3 seconds, and it's going to run the following code. Now we are exporting an asynchronous function named post. We're returning a promise, and inside of a set timeout, which gives us the delay that we need. We're going to keep it simple in this case. We're going to resolve first to make sure that's working. And we're going to say request completed successfully. And we're going to save. So that's going to run our code. And of course, we haven't updated app.ts. We're going to do that now. We're going to call post. Use then because it's a promise, and that's going to return something. So we want the response. In our case, we're just returning a string. So we're going to use it here. We're going to say console.log response. So that's what we want. Now, what happens if we update this? Use the reject function. So reject, and we're going to comment this one out momentarily. We're going to say the request failed. Let's save. Our code is running, waiting for 3 seconds, and we get this error, unhandled promise rejection. Okay, going back to our code, we can see that when we call this method, we are handling the success from resolve, but we're not handling the failure from reject. So let's do that now. We're going to catch errors, and we're going to log them. We can do that with console error. And now we'll rerun 3 seconds again, and then request failed. Now this message is the message that we had here. This is pretty straightforward use of promises. A promise that will do something in the background, and then it will be settled and it will respond to us with either a success message or an error message. Let's go back to the code and make some updates. What I really want is for this promise to succeed or fail roughly 50% of the time. So I'm going to create a new variable, and I'm going to call it success, and that's going to use math.random when is greater than 0.5 to return success. So if it is success, let's resolve. And if it's not, let's reject. For faster testing, I'm going to reduce the amount of waiting to 1 second. So this is working well as a request dummy because we are simulating making a request to the server and then getting a successful or a failure response that is being handled right here. So when does finally come into play? We know that then is called when the promise is resolved, and catch is called when the promise is rejected. Finally is called when the promise is settled, regardless of whether it was successful or not. And this is great because it allows us to do cleanup and state manipulation when the promise is settled, regardless of whether it was successful or not. A good example of this are things like spinners, button states, and other UI related things. We'll get back to the code and update our app.ts so that we have some UI state dummies. First, we're going to create a variable is button disabled equals true, and is spinner active equals true. So as soon as somebody hits the button, this code gets called. The button will be set to disabled and the spinner will be set to active. Then we'll call post, and then we would have to, for example, take these values, and if the response succeeds, we would reset those values to false. And we'll do the same in catch. So imagine this is for a UI, you click submit, and this code gets executed, and the first thing that it does, it sets that is button disabled to true and is spinner active to true. Then you do a post request, and it's either going to be resolved or rejected. And in both cases, you would have to do something like this. This is where finally can help. So we can run finally here, and we can pass in an error function, and then we can clean this up. We can just take this and put it right here. So now our code is a lot less verbose. It may look like finally is pretty simple and straightforward and very obvious, but what I'm seeing is that many, especially junior developers and even some mid-level developers, are not using finally, or they're using them incorrectly. Earlier, I told you that there is a very common mistake that is made when using promises. People try to use finally for things that then and catch are better suited for, because finally is resolved when the promise is settled, whether it's successful or not, but it doesn't give you anything. It doesn't give you the response data or the error. But the other thing that I've seen is obscure bugs that are introduced because the then or finally don't get past the correct values. So let's go back to the code and I'll give you a quick example of that. Imagine that I had more of these states that needed to change. So what I would do is to maybe have a function that says like toggle state. Let's just call it toggle state for now. And we'll just do this. We're going to pass this, and we're just going to set it to the inverse of whatever it is. So we're just toggling the state here. Let's take this over. Okay. So the toggle state will simply take whatever values we have and it will toggle them. And we might want to do that here. So now toggle state. This should work. When this runs, it completes. We can check the status of those values. So we're going to say console.log, and we're going to take a look at is button disabled and is spinner active. So let's run that again. And they are false and false because here they are true. When we enter the post request, they're true, and then finally resets them. So that works. I could do this differently. If I don't need to console log, I could simply take this, and inside there, I can just pass in toggle state. And this will work just fine because finally is getting passed in a function that it will call when it's ready. However, what I see almost too many times is this. Finally gets passed in not the toggle state function object, but the result from it, which in this case is void. And you can see that I have squiggly lines here because toggle state has been told that it's not explicitly returning anything and finally expects a callable function. When I execute it, it gives me this error. Then catch and finally expect a callable function. And if you pass anything else, it will fail. And if it doesn't fail, it will create obscure bugs. I feel like that was a lot, and I'm sorry if you're bored out of your mind by now, but I hope that you have a better understanding of promises and the specific role that finally can play in making your code cleaner. I hope you found it useful. Let me know what you want to learn next.